Picture this for a moment. You're at home, you're with your family, perhaps having dinner together. The children are smiling, the aroma of food is still lingering in the air. And suddenly you hear it. There's a knock on the door. You stiffen. Not because you've hurt anyone, not because you've taken anything, but because of something rather more personal, something you've opted for your family lifestyle. That fear, that possibility was a daily truth for Kody Brown and his wives. For those who may not be aware, Kody Brown was not a typical husband. He was a man with a very public, very unusual family, one which the whole nation would soon be familiar with as the subjects of TLC's reality television show Sister Wives. When the series first launched in Untold, it shocked and intrigued individuals in equal numbers. People were interested. Some were supportive, some were condemnatory, but everyone was discussing it, and why? Because the Browns were living openly something that for many Americans was nothing more than a rumor or a secret practice, polygamy, not merely multiple marriages on paper. And in fact, Kody was legally married to only one wife at a time, but spiritual marriages with more than one person, a family arrangement that was part of their religion and personal preference. Now here's the rub. The Browns weren't residing in a state that quietly turned a blind eye to this sort of arrangement. They were residing in Utah, which has some of the strictest anti-polygamy laws in the country. In Utah, even if you weren't lawfully married to more than one individual, cohabiting with another partner and living as their spouse could be a crime. That made Kody and his family simply living as a family and referring to one another as husband and wife, technically in serious legal jeopardy. And when you expose that kind of life to the nation on television, it is not long before the wrong people, or, as in this case, the state authorities, take an interest. It started as whispers, folks asking, can they really do that on television? Before long, the whispers became local rumor, then national headlines, and then legal intimidation. For the Browns, it was more than a TV narrative. It was their real life. The cameras would depart, the crew would break down, and the family would remain seated there, awaiting if the next vehicle to arrive would be police looking to make an example of them. That kind of tension doesn't just loom over one individual, it hangs over the whole family. By late Untold sand into Untold, the pressure was mounting. Kody could see what was coming. In Utah, these laws had been on the books for well over a century, and there was no sign that they would simply look the other way because a family had a TV show. In fact, if anything, the show had brought more attention and more risk, so the Browns made a decision. Had they remained in Utah, they were living in a shadow waiting for the other shoe to fall. That wasn't the life they had planned for their children. It wasn't the environment they felt they should be a part of. And so they packed up and relocated the whole family to Las Vegas, Nevada, a state with a very different attitude towards polygamy. Nevada also maintained laws prohibiting it on the books, but they weren't actively going after families living in private without attempting to legally register multiple marriages. Moving may have alleviated the short-term threat of arrest, but for Kody, Robyn, Mary, Janelle, and Christine, it didn't alleviate the larger issue. They felt they were being driven out of their home state for nothing more than their personal choices and relationships. They weren't imposing anything on anyone else, but they also didn't want to hide in fear. And it was then that a new concept seized them, one that would turn their plight from an individual family issue into a court fight with national implications. They were not going to go quietly and be trouble. They were going to take on the law. This was no small move. Picking a fight with the state of Utah in court was a monumental gamble. It meant greater publicity, greater scrutiny, and the potential that they might lose, and lose handsomely. But to the Browns, the gamble was worth it. They felt that the law was antiquated, unfair, and, most significantly, unconstitutional. It wasn't about their family anymore. It was about each and every family in Utah, and even in the nation, that lived differently but deserved the same freedom from government intrusion and right to privacy. In Untold, the Browns formally sued Utah's Attorney General and Utah County's District Attorney. The case would be known as Brown v. Boomin, although over time people simply referred to it as Brown v. Utah. At the center of the case was an issue that cut deeply into America's enduring controversy over individual freedom. Could the government criminalize consenting adults for living together and being married? Even if they weren't formally married on paper? For the Browns, the solution was obvious. No, it shouldn't be illegal. But Utah had a long tradition of strict anti-polygamy laws rooted in deeply ingrained political and cultural practice. These laws originated in the 14th century, when Utah was still a territory with heightened tensions with the federal government. In order to become a state, Utah was forced to promise to ban polygamy outright, and that prohibition had never been repealed. No one had successfully challenged this portion of the law by the time the Browns brought their case. That made them pioneers, legally, socially, and in the court of public opinion. The initial phases of the lawsuit garnered huge attention. News teams, journalists, lawyers commenting on the case. Everybody wanted to know what was next. Was it all just a publicity gimmick from a reality TV family? Or was this the start of a significant shift in how America personal relationships? Inside the Brown household, the reality was far from glamorous. Legal meetings, consultations with attorneys, and constant media coverage became part of their daily lives. They were determined to push forward, but the emotional toll was heavy. Not only were they fighting for a principle, but they also had to protect their children from the whirlwind of public opinion swirling around them. And so the stage was set. The Browns had gone from being reality TV personalities to plaintiffs in a federal lawsuit that had the potential to challenge more than a century of legal tradition. The cameras kept rolling, but now there was something bigger than TV ratings at stake. The struggle for their right to exist without the threat of prosecution and to exist as they believe had officially begun. And it all began because they collectively decided they would no longer allow the law to force them underground. By Untold, the Browns weren't simply a family with a show on television. They were a mission-oriented family. When they left Utah and headed to Las Vegas, it wasn't necessarily to escape the knock at the door from the authorities. Kody and his wives knew in their hearts that escaping the problem didn't make it go away. The statute that had driven them out of their home state still existed, and it might still be used against other families without the help of cameras and the public eye to help their cause. That's when the Browns made their decision: if we don't stand up for this, who will? In July, Untold, aided by a team of lawyers, they sued the state of Utah County Attorney Jeff Beaumont, to be specific, in federal court. It was not an impulsive move. It was planned out carefully, prayed about, and gone over around the kitchen table numerous times. The Browns understood that as soon as they entered a courtroom, their lives would be picked apart not only by attorneys and judges, but by the whole country. Their mission was simple in terms, but gargantuan in scale: to challenge the provision of Utah's anti-polygamy statute that prohibited living with multiple partners if you were already married to someone else. Now let's hold up a moment here, because for everyone really, the term polygamy makes them think of multiple marriage certificates, one man legally marrying several women, or vice versa. But the law in Utah did a lot more than that. Even if you only had one valid marriage license, as soon as you called someone else your wife or husband, or cohabited in a manner that appeared to be marriage, you could be convicted of a felony. That meant that the Browns, who were following a religious and cultural practice of having spiritual wives in addition to their one legal marriage, were criminalizing themselves simply by existing as they did. And they weren't alone. Furtively, throughout Utah and elsewhere in the nation, there were thousands of families living such lives, hiding from scrutiny, constantly looking over shoulders, fearing that the wrong individual would report them. The Browns' constitutional claim went straight to the very core of the U.S. Constitution. They argued that the cohabitation prohibition in Utah was infringing upon their First Amendment rights, the freedom to practice their faith unmolested, and their 14th Amendment privacy and liberty rights in their own intimate relationship. In other words, they believed that the state had no authority to determine who consenting adults could live with or who they could call their spouse, as long as everyone was there voluntarily and no one was getting hurt. But this wasn't about protecting the Browns alone. During interviews at the time, Kody and his wives were firm. They were fighting for all plural family. Christine explained it in simple terms during one episode: "We're not trying to change everyone's life. We just want the law to stop treating ours like a crime." For the state, though, the case was one of upholding laws that had been a part of Utah's history since it became a state in the state's constitution. Ever since its inclusion as a state in had included a clear prohibition against polygamy. The law had its roots in a history of political bargains, religious splits, and moral arguments going back to the Babates. Tampering with it, or even disassembling portions of it, wasn't going to be done lightly. The initial phases of the lawsuit were heated. The Browns' lawyers framed the case around the argument that Utah's law was not just anachronistic, it was too broad and discriminatorily aimed at people based on what they believed and the shape of their family. They presented expert witnesses to speak about how the law instilled fear and compelled families to hide. They demonstrated how, in practice, Utah never prosecuted bigamy for fraud or abuse, but maintained the law as a threat to peaceful plural family. Conversely, the state's attorneys contended that the law served to prevent exploitation and safeguard vulnerable individuals, especially women and children. They maintained that repealing the cohabitation clause would make it more difficult to prevent abusive situations within some communities. In the meantime, the media were enjoying themselves. There were headlines galore such as Sister Wives' take on Utah and Brown family fights for right to plural marriage. Some commentators were treating it as a legal oddity, others as a serious challenge to individual freedom. For those who were fans of Sister Wives, it was compelling television. Not only were they viewing family meals and relationship breakdowns, but an actual court case in real time alongside. Behind the scenes of the Brown home, things were not as neat as they appeared on TV. Getting ready for a legal fight involved spending hours with attorneys, poring over thick legal briefs that were like weighty bricks, and dealing with the fact that their entire personal life was on public record. Robyn, the youngest wife at the time, was ambivalent. In one sense, she was behind the struggle. In another, she fretted about what it would do to their children to have their family talked about in the papers and on television shows like some sort of political agenda instead of simply a family. Mary, the initial wife, would usually remain quieter during public interviews, but friends who were close to her indicated that she felt this battle was worth it, not for herself, but for her daughter as well as future generations. This was personal for Kody on all levels. His family had left their whole lives to escape what he believed to be an unfair law. And now, here he was before judges and cameras, explaining to the world that he wasn't going to simply walk away. By late Artshandling Ishar, the case was in full gear. Legal papers accumulated, both sides holding strong. The Browns had succeeded in transforming what might have been a low-key relocation to another state into a full-blown test of one of the most unusual and contentious laws in the nation. In a lot of senses, they'd already won. They'd taken a law that nobody even knew was on the books and brought it into the national spotlight. You might or might not have agreed with them, but you couldn't help but notice them. The stage was now set for what would come next, a courtroom ruling that could either solidify Utah's authority to police private relationships or rewrite the rules altogether. In December, something remarkable occurred. The sort of dramatic courtroom turn you only hope to find on legal TV shows, not in the real lives of a reality show family. Following 2 agonizing years of not knowing, waiting, and endless guessing, a federal judge at last rendered the verdict in the Browns' suit against the state of Utah. And the news was mind-blowing. The judge invalidated the central part of Utah's anti-polygamy statute, the section that criminalized cohabitation with someone other than your legal spouse. It was not a minor adjustment to the law. It was a body blow to the very heart of the law that had driven the Browns underground and nearly ended their way of life. To get a sense of just how large this was, you have to take into account what the weather was like in Utah back then. For years, the state's laws not only banned multiple marriage licenses, but extended far enough to encompass individuals who company habitated as if married, even without licenses, when one of them was already technically married to someone else. This cohabitation provision essentially criminalized plural marriage in any guise, whether it was spiritual, religious, or symbolic. For Kody Brown and his wives, that provision was the sword of Damocles above their heads. It was why they had moved their kids out and escaped to Nevada in the dead of night back in Artshandling Ishar. It was why they had opted to fight in the first place. The law did not simply govern marriage license. It governed their private lives, their spiritual practices, and even the language they employed to refer to one another. And all at once, with a single decision, that specific threat had been ruled unconstitutional. The judge's rationale was based upon the U.S. Constitution's provisions for protection of due process, privacy, and religious freedom. He drew an analogy between the prohibition on cohabitation and other such antiquated laws that had previously intruded into the private lives of consenting adults. Just like the Supreme Court had invalidated laws prohibiting interracial marriage or outlawing same-sex intimacy, this federal court saw that the government did not have any valid basis to criminalize a family for merely residing together and referring to themselves as married. It was surreal for the Browns. For years, they had been painted as the state's outlaws. Overnight, they were on the victorious side of a historic ruling. It wasn't only a legal win, it was a personal vindication. They had everything to lose by making it public. They had opened themselves to criticism, hate mail, and media attention. And now a federal court was telling them you were justified in standing your ground. The decision sent shockwaves far beyond the Brown family. News organizations nationwide scrambled to report the story. Mainstream dailies, such as the New York Times and the Washington Post, published articles examining the legal implications. Cable television pundits speculated on whether this was a move toward wider acceptance of non-traditional family units, or if it would cause havoc in the court system. For Brown supporters and other plural families, it was a celebratory day. They viewed it as a long-awaited recognition that consenting adults should be able to define their own relationships without the threat of criminal sanction. But not everyone was pleased. Critics of the decision said it could undermine the state's power to protect vulnerable members of polygamous groups, including women and children, in cases where coercion or abuse can happen. They feared that without stringent laws, some groups could use the ruling to excuse abusive practice. This conflict between the rights of consenting adults and the responsibility of the state to avoid harm entered the broader national discourse. And for a matter of months, the Browns were its focal point. The family wasn't afraid to speak out about what the decision meant to them. On Sister Wives, fans witnessed their relief, their thankfulness, and even their amazement that such a massive legal victory had occurred. Kody explained how this was never about TV ratings or publicity. It was about making sure that his children, and all children who grow up in plural families, do not have to live in fear of watching their parents be prosecuted because they are who they are. Legally, the ruling didn't make polygamy completely legal in Utah. Multiple marriage licenses were still illegal, but it eliminated the criminal sanctions for cohabiting in a plural household, a significant shift for families like the Browns. For a fleeting, shining moment, the Browns' risk seemed to have paid off in every way. They had defied the state of Utah, and they had succeeded. The decision was a testament to individual liberty, a reminder that occasionally the law can shift when citizens are courageous enough to challenge it. Of course, as history would prove, the fight wasn't yet done. Utah officials were not going to take defeat lying down. But at that time in December Easter, the Browns gave themselves permission to rejoice. It was a sweet and potent triumph, one they would cling to as the battle entered its second phase. For the Browns, that courtroom win in Easter had been sweet. They had challenged one of the nation's strictest anti-polygamy statutes, and for a fleeting moment, they had emerged victorious. But in the game of courtroom battles, victories are fleeting. At times they disappear, not because you were mistaken, but because the law determines you never should have had the right to battle in the first place. And that is precisely what occurred in Untold. The news landed like a gut punch. The Browns' win was overturned by a federal appeals court. But the thing is, it wasn't because judges suddenly thought Utah's anti-polygamy statutes were flawless or just. No, the reversal was based on something that few people outside of the legal system ever discuss: standing. If you've never been pulled into a court of law, standing is likely just another bit of legal mumbo-jumbo. But in plain English, what it means is this: in order to sue someone, you must demonstrate that you're actually in danger right now, not merely back then and not merely in theory. You must demonstrate that the law being challenged is presently impacting you at this instant. And that's when things became problematic for Kody and his family. When the Browns initially brought their case in Untold, the danger was present. Utah officials might have shown up at their doorstep at any time, charged them, and taken them to criminal court. But by Untold, when the appeals court was considering the case, Utah prosecutors had publicly announced they were no longer prioritizing polygamy cases unless there was some other offense, such as abuse or fraud. That meant, at least in theory, the Browns were no longer in imminent danger. The appeals court essentially said, hey, you might not agree with the law, but if the state is not attempting to enforce it upon you currently, you don't have the legal basis to continue this lawsuit. It was a technical knockout. The court never addressed the larger, deeper question, whether Utah's law was fair or constitutional. That argument remained out there in the air, unanswered, yet for the Browns, it was a disaster turn of events. Imagine years in a public fight, having put your personal life under a national microscope, investing into legal fees, braving headlines, I-5 4x4, investing into legal fees, braving headlines, and then losing everything on a legal technicality. No, we were wrong moment. Instead, a quiet, cold ending left them without clear victory to hold on to. And yet, even in loss, the case had already shifted the dialogue in America. Prior to the Browns' lawsuit, most didn't even whisper about polygamy or think about it in terms of something they'd read about in old history books or scandal front page. They dismissed it as outdated, weird, or even shameful. But the lawsuit, and the media frenzy around it, compelled the nation to examine the reality of contemporary plural family. Talk shows, news media, and lawyers debated the Browns' case from all sides. Was it freedom of religion, the right to privacy, or was it protecting vulnerable individuals from exploitation? Each question ignited another fiery debate, and the Browns were caught right in the middle. Robyn, Kody's lawful wife and newest wife, frequently discussed the emotional price it all had cost. She wasn't merely fighting for her own marriage, she was fighting for the right of her children to be able to grow up without the threat that their parents might be able to be treated like criminals just because they were living together. For Kody, it wasn't even about his own household. It was about dismantling what he felt was unjustified, discriminatory laws that had no place in a free society. Even so, when the ruling was announced in Artshandling Ishirliu, the emotional impact was genuine. Sister Wives fans followed the family attempting to move ahead, but the letdown hung over them. You could witness it in how Kody spoke of the case in interviews, frustration, yes, but also a sort of exhausted acceptance. They had given it their best shot and the legal system had shut the door. But even though they lost in court, the Browns' fight wasn't wasted. Legal experts often point out that sometimes the biggest impact of a lawsuit isn't the verdict, it's the conversation it sparks. And in that sense, the Browns had achieved something monumental. They had put a human face on a law that most people didn't even realize existed. They had made folks wonder whether cohabitation was a crime at all. And they had demonstrated that polygamy in contemporary America wasn't something out of musty old tales. It was occurring, quietly, in communities nationwide. The reversal stung, but it left a gap in the wall. The Browns had forced the issue into public view, and that meant that future attempts to challenge the law may find it easier to gain entry. Even if they were not the ones to witness the ultimate triumph, they had sown seeds that might sprout in the future. For Kody and Robyn, there was life to continue. The cameras continued to roll. The melodrama within the family, weddings, breakups, and shifting allegiances would go on to unfold on Sister Wives. But beneath all of that reality television drama, they would forever bear the wounds of that legal battle. It was a reminder that it takes more than winning one time to change the law. It takes enduring the protracted, grueling process of working a system that resists change. The Artshandling Ishilip overturn may have sealed their case, but it did not seal the argument, and if anything, it served to make the problem more pressing. The Browns had made their stand, and though the law did not buckle for them this time, they had compelled America to hear and to doubt. And that, in its own right, was a triumph. Although the Browns didn't leave with a permanent legal win, Brown v. Utah made an irrefutable imprint on America. For decades, discussions of polygamy had been all but hushed up, hidden behind religious conflict or presented as salacious, scandalous tabloid fodder. But this case, with Kody Brown Robyn Brown and the rest of the Sister Wives clan, put the issue out in the open in a way America hadn't experienced in decades. To many viewers, it was the first time that they had ever heard the human, personal aspect of polygamy. Prior to Brown v. Utah, if you mention the word polygamy, most people imagine dark compounds, clandestine weddings, or sensational police raids. And yet here were the Browns, a contemporary, transparent, and TV-ready family, inviting millions of guests into their sitting rooms each Sunday evening on TLC. They weren't doing anything covert. They weren't saying they were perfect. They were simply presenting life as they lived it. Parents raising children, couples working through relationship issues, and a large family working to stay intact in the face of tremendous public scrutiny. By the time their case reached headlines, America already felt like it knew them. That familiarity made a difference. It's one thing to debate a law when you're talking about strangers. It's another thing when the people affected are ones you've watched laugh, cry, argue, and celebrate milestones for years. The Browns never said they were political activists. They didn't begin seeking a court fight, they were forced into it. But in challenging Utah's law, they became the faces of a new movement that asks whether adults should be able to live in consenting plural marriages without risking prison. And although the appeals court later overrode their initial victory, the tale did not conclude. The Browns had already sown a seed in the national dialogue. They'd prompted legislators, legal analysts, and regular folks to grapple with the query, Where does the boundary of morality reside in relation to legality? In Utah, the waves churned for years. Public opinion started to move, gradually but inexorably. By artindling arcers, something surprising occurred. Utah legislators voted to lower polygamy between willing adults from a felony to an infraction. That would mean rather than risking prison time, plural families would risk something akin to a traffic ticket. The Browns did not receive the blanket legal immunity that they had been seeking back in Arsenling Isersan, but this legislative shift was nevertheless a giant stride away from the times when polygamous families needed to live in fear of being arrested. That shift didn't occur in isolation. It followed decades of public visibility, arguments, and the inevitable fact that concealing polygamy hadn't suppressed it, merely made it more difficult for families to live openly and securely. Whether or not others concurred with the Browns' decisions, most people could see that sending parents to prison for their relationships wasn't good for the children or society, and that's where Brown v. Utah really made its mark, not only in the law books, but in the minds and hearts of viewers at home. The Browns reminded us of something greater than a single court case. In America, the law and individual freedom tend to exist in a vulnerable, thin tension. Sometimes it's not big institutions or national figures who ignite change. Other times, it's a regular family willing to open their doors, risk public opinion, and submit their private lives for a microscope. That makes a nation pause, look, and think. Kody and Robyn Brown and Mary, Janelle, and Christine never faked it. Sister wives caught them arguing, suffering heartbreak, and occasionally uncomfortable moments. But so too did it catch the little human moments, children racing through the kitchen, too many plates on the table at dinner time, and moments of gentle support between spouses who knew the world would never accept them fully. Even when the courtroom lights went out and the headlines switched, the Browns' tale continued doing its job. People who once believed polygamy was some exotic and strange phenomenon started to think differently about it. Not that it meant they suddenly accepted it, but they started to realize these were human beings, not stereotypes. In a way, that may have been the Browns' greatest victory. Laws can be rewritten, rulings can be overturned, but changing the way people see an issue is something much harder to undo. By putting a relatable, human face on a controversial topic, they softened the edges of the conversation and paved the way for future discussions to be more about fairness, and freedom, and less about fear. Today, decades since Brown v. Utah, the argument about polygamy is still alive. But owing to the Browns, it's no longer hidden in the dark. Whether you view them as trailblazers, revolutionaries, or simply a family that wanted to be alone, there can be no doubt that their story has become part of American legal and cultural history. And perhaps that's the real takeaway. Change doesn't always come in a clean, decisive courtroom victory. And sometimes it comes in messy, complicated, drawn-out battles that still leave something behind. A conversation, an awareness, a shift in perspective. The Browns didn't get everything they wanted from the courts, but they did get something powerful. They made the nation look at them, and by extension, look at itself.